everybody. My name is Heidi Adams. I'm the Chief Patient Advocate at Rx4good. This webinar is a joint brainchild of Rx4good and Pyxis Partners. So on behalf of Pyxis, Rx4good, and our stellar presenting team here today, I want to welcome everyone to our webinar on this important topic, the role of language access in clinical trials. So I'll start just with a little background on our two agencies first. We established a partnership earlier this year to provide a comprehensive service offering to our clients who were really seeking to engage diverse communities in medical research. And they were looking to fulfill increasing regulatory requirements for more representative trials. So to this task, Rx4good brings deep expertise in pharma patient advocacy and engagement and in forging innovative partnerships that help improve patients' lives. And Pyxis Partners is a social impact firm focused on work at the intersection of health policy, advocacy, and community engagement. So I want to start by just saying one of the foundational elements of reaching diverse communities is language access, or communicating in ways that allow all people to understand and engage in critical services. So our hope is that a deep dive into this topic will provide you with useful insights and tools for your work. We're thrilled to have a diverse group of attendees with us today. Most of you are involved in biotech research or pharma manufacturing. Experience with this topic varies widely, so about half of our participants today are relatively new to the field. So hopefully we have something for everyone in our webinar today. We wanted to start with just a couple of polling questions to learn more specifically about your familiarity with language access plans and their role in your work. So I think you should be able to see the polls that are open here. If you could respond. And then Avery, let me know when it looks like we're complete. Good. Let's see.
Yep. Can you see the results?
Yeah, okay, I see them now. So it looks like about 38% of you have read the newly published HHS and FDA language access plans. So hopefully we'll shed some light on those for you. And then working on increasing diversity, about 69% of you, this is an explicit part of your job. So thank you for joining us today. We hope that we can provide you with valuable information. One quick housekeeping detail before we get started. As questions arise throughout the webinar, please enter them into the Q&A box. Some of them may be answered in the course of this session, but we'll do our best to address all the rest during the Q&A period near the end of the webinar. We've reserved some time for that. So with that, I'd like to invite all four of our speakers to introduce themselves and just invite you all to settle in and enjoy this webinar on language access. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on this webinar. My name is Samara, and I'm a public health educator here at Access, which is a nonprofit organization in Dearborn, Michigan. I have been working with Access for about 10 months now, and at Access, I primarily work on the All of Us Research Project in collaboration with Henry Ford Health, which are our enrollment partners. We are trying to diversify medical research within the MENA, or Middle Eastern North African population, and the main goal is to try to figure out why some people stay healthy and why others get sick. Today, I will be discussing language access on the ground and what it looks like. And with that, I would like to pass it over to Luis.
Thank you, Samara. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Esteves. I work with Avidity Biosciences as a member of their patient advocacy team. I've been with Avidity for a little under 5 years now, with the last 2 being directly focused on patient advocacy and our health equity initiatives. So I'm going to talk about the work that Avidity is doing to increase the diversity in our clinical trials and the task force which we launched as a part of those efforts. Thank you for having me. I'm going to pass it over to Grisel now.
Thank you, Luis. Hi, everybody. My name is Doctora Grisel Marie Robles Schrader, she, ella pronouns. I'm a community psychologist and I work at Pyxis Partners. I serve in the role of Senior Director of Engagement. And for those who are not familiar, Pyxis Partners is a social impact firm, and we're focused on working at the intersection of health policy, of advocacy, and community engagement. I'm excited to be here today to share my passion for integrating culture and language to improve diversity and community engagement in health research as well as health evaluation. I've spent, and I think this background is really important to lay the foundation for everything that we share today. I've spent 20 years working in academic health settings at national coordinating centers for multi-site studies, and I grew up working in hospitals around Chicago and the Chicagoland area where Spanish and Polish, Tagalog, and Italian were languages that were spoken by the communities that we served. I've worked at Northwestern's Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, where I had the opportunity to support research teams conducting different types of research studies, focus on a wide range of health topics, consulting on how they can improve their community engagement strategies by working with relevant constituents to adopt practical strategies to improve research design, research implementation, as well as dissemination. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Grisel. Hi, my name is Rebecca Block. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Senior Director of Research here at Rx4good. So I oversee all of our research activities and focus primarily on our primary data activities. I'm trained as a clinical social worker and also a social scientist. I've been doing patient experience research and health equity research for a little over 20 years now. And I'm excited today to share in this webinar with you. My passion really lies in working in patient advocacy through this lens of inclusion and access towards a goal of health equity. We've done a good deal of work with increasing diversity on clinical trials with several of our clients, which is a great opportunity to really think about language access. And we'll talk today about that connection between the overall goal of increasing diversity in trials and where language access fits. We're super excited. We have a busy agenda today, so we'll just jump right in. We all always like to start with just some rules of engagement. So how we'll work together today. We really invite you to be active participants. So as Heidi mentioned in the beginning, there is a Q&A box. So please, put questions in there. We have time set aside near the end of the webinar to have a Q&A session. So please feel free to enter your questions. If while we're speaking, there's a concept or a word or something that's just not making sense, please throw that in the chat because we would love to be able to address that sooner rather than later. So if you're feeling like you're falling behind or for some reason, we're using an acronym, which we'll do our best not to do. But if we are, please just drop a little note in the chat so we can, of course, correct. Sometimes these conversations can be difficult. We have different perspectives. And so we want to, if you are sharing, we invite you, we invite your candor. We also invite you to help us maintain a learning environment that's professional and respectful, because this is meant to be a learning opportunity for everyone here today. Our overarching objectives for the day really in 4 main areas. One is to frame language access planning in the context of increasing diversity in clinical trials, as I alluded to earlier. And then also to make that connection between language access plans and the diversity action plan requirements that many or most of you are probably already working on or have submitted. We also want to make sure that you have that overview of when we say language access, what are we talking about and what are language access plans and what are the components? And then we'll also have the opportunity to share some case studies with you so you can hear about what this looks like in the real world.
Thank you, Rebecca. So Today's discussion is important. Not only is there an ethical imperative to diversify clinical trials, as historically marginalized groups have been underrepresented in clinical research, which is one root cause fueling health disparities. Diversifying clinical trials improves the scientific validity, given that there are biological differences across and within different groups of people that can result in differences to responses to treatment. This work also aligns with FDA and European Medicines Agency's regulatory guidelines, as both agencies are pushing for more inclusive trial designs. And this could lead to research innovations as diverse trials contribute to the growing body of data on how different populations respond to treatment, which can inform future research studies and then lead to more innovations and inclusive healthcare solutions. And finally, from a business perspective, this impacts two opportunities. It could lead to expanding market access as your teams improve how it serves these communities, which then increases trust or has the opportunity to increase trust and confidence in your team's ability to effectively work with different communities, which in turn can strengthen those partnerships. As we all know, it's not as if we conduct one study on a particular health topic. Research spans whole careers as teams find themselves working on a health topic and then producing new and different iterations of a study. The second impact related to expanding market access is that research teams can save money by engaging communities in the research design, money and time, by engaging communities in the research design process, addressing culture and language needs. Teams can avoid the pitfalls which cost time and money, and that can impact factors such as reducing the lag time between your IRB approval and then your first enrollment. So in summary, I think it's important for us to talk about all the aspects and the rationale for increasing diversity in clinical trials. It leads to better science, more inclusive healthcare advancements, and when it's done right, it has the potential to increase partnerships among researchers and community constituents that can benefit companies' bottom lines, but also improve issues of health equity. Next slide. So what is language access? When we talk about language access, we're referring to providing individuals with limited English proficiency and individuals with hearing impairments and/or those who are legally blind with the ability to understand and engage in critical services such as healthcare and legal services. And this is done by using interpreters, translated materials, and culturally appropriate resources. This ensures equitable participation and effective communication, helping individuals understand and act on information that directly affects their health and well-being, as well as their rights. So originating from mandates like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, language access policies are critical for compliance. In many public and private institutions, it's aiming to eliminate language and communication-based barriers to essential services. All of this is intrinsically linked to research integrity. Next slide. So understanding what language access means, then language access plans are simply documents that spell out a plan for providing services that support effective communication with individuals that are non-English speaking or have limited English proficiency in this country, or are living with a disability. And the plan is intended to be tailored to the resources and the needs of individual organizations. Next slide. So at the beginning of the call, we asked how many people, and about half of you all have read the HHS and FDA language access plans. We will share a copy of the link to those plans at the end of the webinar. But I want to just go over, what is included in these plans. So they cover 10 components with corresponding action plans. They're essentially one and the same. And the first, we've placed them here in 3 buckets. The first is to conduct needs assessment activities. So what you want to do is assess the language assistant needs of the current or potential customers, or in this case, your research participants. And you want to understand the types of resources and support currently available at your organization. This could include, but may not be limited to, additional funding set-asides or bilingual, multilingual, and bicultural staff that have experience preparing language access plans, and so on. Results from the needs assessments will then inform programs, policies, processes, and budgeting necessary to implement activities in the other two buckets. So the second bucket of information in these plans focuses on services such as interpretation, written translation, digital information available on organizational web pages or newsletters, and announcements and signage about the availability of language assistance at no cost to the participant. So for example, I recently received my health insurance, an invoice from my health insurance company, and the very last page always includes information about the available language resources that they provide to their customers at no cost. So that's just one example of announcing the free language assistance programming that a company or a firm can offer. I also wanted to flag that the federal guidelines announced the availability of consultation with HHS partners for additional support. Finally, that last bucket talks about activities related to infrastructure building, right? And you do this to ensure that there are policies, programs, practices in place to sustain these efforts beyond just one study or project. These include staff training programs, evaluation and monitoring plans, and then for those receiving HHS fundings, there's a section on compliance. Now I'm going to pass it over to Samara.
Thank you. So at Access, I primarily work on the recruitment and engagement portion of the All of Us research program. So when it comes to recruitment, if research materials are available in participants' native language, it can improve engagement and participation rates. Potential participants are more likely to trust and feel comfortable with the study if they see that the research team is making an effort to accommodate their linguistic needs. It can also increase retention rates as participants are more likely to remain in the study if they can continue to understand all materials and communications. For example, the community we primarily serve speak Arabic, so we offer flyers in Arabic. This makes it easier for participants to grasp a better understanding of the All of Us research program. If recruitment materials such as consent forms, surveys, and informational brochures are only available in one language, it may exclude non-speakers of that language, limiting diversity and representativeness of the participant pool. For example, the surveys for All of Us is only offered in English and/or Spanish. Our population focuses on the Middle Eastern North African population. Therefore, surveys need to be offered in more languages so we can allow such individuals to understand what is being asked. Offering materials in multiple languages ensures that all potential participants have an equal opportunity to engage in the study. However, we do have staff that speak Arabic, but since the surveys take about an hour to complete, this can lead to staff burnout. Also, it can be hard finding translators at all times. If participants can engage with materials in their preferred language, they are more likely to fully understand the questions, instructions, and expectations. This leads to higher quality and more accurate data, and misunderstandings due to language barriers can introduce biases or errors into research results. For example, I don't speak Arabic, so in the beginning, we had a one-page flyer that just said medical research in Arabic, and that would sway people away. So we changed medical research to learn more about your health, and this in turn grabbed the community's attention and they wanted to learn more about the program. And with that, I would like to end by saying that language does matter.
Thank you so much, Samara. That's a great segue, really, to talking about this connection that we alluded to in the very beginning of language access plans, diversity action plans, and what that means for effective practice, and then the overall goal of increasing diversity in clinical trials. So if we sort of think about increasing diversity in trials is almost the umbrella, right? That's what we're all working towards. Diversity action plans, as you know, are now a requirement for phase 3 and pivotal studies. So that's one piece of this. Language access plans are sort of, this diagram was our best representation. What we really needed was something with a lot more lines, I think, because when we think about what a language access plan is, the components of the language access plan really are required in order to fulfill the diversity action plans that you all are creating and writing. The other piece of this that we're not going to go into a lot already, but Samara and Grisel already shared some examples that are relevant to this is community engagement. So we have to recognize the need to engage community, and many of you are very good at this and do this already in many ways, engaging patients and families and community members in the design of a study, in the way a protocol is implemented, in site training, things like that. So we don't want to lose that, because the community engagement component, really, it could almost be across the bottom of this slide, right? It's really the foundation here. Well, let me back up for a minute, because we keep using the word diversity. So I want to just sort of clarify and offer up what we mean when we're saying diversity. It's important that we think about diversity from a broad lens. And again, you've heard this from Samara's example and from Grisel's examples, that when we talk about diversity, we are talking about race and ethnicity and language. We're also talking about age and gender identity and sexual orientation and socioeconomic status and education level and disability and health status and literacy. We're talking about so many different aspects of diversity when we talk about diversity. And similarly, when we talk about language access, we don't only mean a different spoken language. We're also talking about folks with disabilities, whether it's folks who are deaf and hard of hearing, blind, folks who are living with communication disorders. Language access is relevant in all of those arenas. Now we know that our goal is increasing diversity in trials, right? We want the sample on a trial to be more representative of the patient population. In order to do that, we're going to need language access plans. And we know that we're not quite there yet, right? We're not quite reaching that representation that we know we need. And that's why you're here. At least I think that's why you're here. One of the things that we need to think about when we start thinking about this is that it's the same people who always get left behind, right? It's the same populations, and you know this. I'm not telling anyone anything that you don't know. Oftentimes women are fewer, lower participant numbers on trials. People of color. One example of this in some, again, these are approximate numbers. You know, these numbers are tricky to get. But if we think of the Latino and Hispanic population is about 17% of the US population and 8% of clinical trial participants. 17 and 8. So we know that we're not there yet. As an aside, Latino and Hispanic identifying investigators are at about 8%. So again, not representing in the population of investigators in the research either. Other groups that we know are getting left behind, LGBTQ plus folks, people living in rural areas because of access to sites, folks with low literacy or low health literacy. This ties into our language access issues. And of course, anyone who speaks anything other than English. Another example for you, in a survey done here in the US, about 86% of folks who immigrated here from an Asian country report speaking a language other than English at home, 86%, and only 14% reporting speaking only English at home. So again, when we start to think about what we're doing and how we're reaching out to communities, we can see language access becomes a very, very prominent issue for us to address. And here's our chance to make a difference, right? So right now, diversity action plans are required. Language access plans, while they are not officially required by the FDA, essentially the components are required in order to meet your goals set forth in your diversity action plan, not to mention its effective practice, right? As Grisel spoke about in the very beginning of this webinar, you're engaging the community early, you're saving budget, you're saving time, and you're increasing not only the number of participants on your study, but the representativeness of the sample itself, as Samara talked about. I'm pleased to introduce Louise, who's going to share an example of the work that Avidity is doing right now towards increasing diversity in clinical trials overall and highlight some of the initiatives specific to language access.
Thank you, Rebecca. So you and Grisel did a great job just teeing up the issue of clinical trial diversity and how it really goes hand in hand with language access planning. So I'm pleased to talk about Avidity and our efforts as an industry partner to increase clinical trial diversity, and also how language access initiatives really play a large role in the roadmap that we developed to sort of implement initiatives that can increase the diversity of our own clinical trials. So a little bit about Avidity. We are in the rare neuromuscular space, and we have 3 programs in clinical trials for 3 different rare neuromuscular conditions. We are in the process of developing these clinical trials, but we see ourselves as innovators and making sure that we're conducting science both ethical way and in just a best practice, including the patient populations who are always excluded from clinical research. So we see this as an opportunity to do our part as industry members to address the systemic, complex, and layered issues of clinical trial diversity. So we put together a task force comprised of members from the Avidity organization from different functional areas to discuss what can be done to start to bridge those gaps and kind of shrink those disparities that exist between clinical participation in different populations. We also conducted an internal survey, and we're pleased to find that many of our internal Avidity team members feel strongly as well about increasing clinical trial diversity and agree that there's something that needs to be done. We then conducted research by surveying the clinical sites that we work with across various programs of ours, across all 3 of our lead clinical programs. And we were pleased to also find that many clinical sites, investigators, and staff all also feel the same way about wanting to increase the diversity of clinical trials, believing that there's an ethical imperative to do so, as Grisel mentioned, but also that it is very scientifically sound. But there is a desire to also have some guidance and direction. And I think this is where there's an important opportunity for partnership between industry partners and clinical sites to promote diversity. And as you all know, and it's the reason you're all here as well, the FDA requires sponsors of clinical studies to submit diversity action plans to the FDA. So I'm going to talk a bit more about our approach to increasing clinical trial diversity and how it relates to our clinical programs. So like I mentioned, we did internal research, we polled our clinical sites, and we also convened a task force comprised of 14 members from across our organization that then worked with Rx4good to develop a roadmap that could be integrated into our overall clinical development strategy. So for context, at the time that we were developing this roadmap, most of our clinical programs were already in the clinic. However, a key characteristic of the roadmap that we developed with Rx4good was that it could be integrated at any point of the drug development process. So whether you're preclinical or in the clinical development stage, or even looking forward past clinical development, there are initiatives that could be undertaken by your organization. And it integrated pretty well into our primary directive at Avidity, which is to bring new therapies to patients as quickly as possible. Another key characteristic of the roadmap that was developed was that it was organized by functional area as well. So if you're in HR, clinical development, operations, medical affairs, or patient advocacy, there were initiatives that applied to your functional area. And you could work together with other teams to see what needs to be implemented, who's taking ownership of what, so that way we could all work together as an organization and a cross-functional team to develop a plan to address clinical trial diversity. And another key characteristic was the implementation of initiatives that both have short-term as well as long-term impact. So as you all know, this is a systemic issue and requires a lot of effort on multiple fronts to truly bridge the gaps in clinical trial participation. But there are a number of initiatives that we saw had short-term but maximum impact, and a lot of them really related to language access and language access initiatives, which I'll get to in a bit. But here's a little bit more about the methodology of the task force. So 14 members from research, clinical teams, medical affairs who gathered insights. We read a lot of literature and were informed about the existing barriers so that we could really understand what barriers there were to equitable clinical trial participation, so that we could then break off into working groups and brainstorm initiatives that could be undertaken by various functions at our company. We then developed a roadmap with Rx4good as a comprehensive plan of company-wide strategies that can be broken up into phase of development, like I mentioned, or functional area that owns these initiatives. And over the past year, we've begun to, once we completed the roadmap, we've begun to plan kind of what the implementation phase looks like and how we're going to work with each of the functional teams to implement these initiatives, kind of strategically decide what can we do right now and then what can be built on in the future, and make sure that we have a process in place to evaluate how things are going and kind of fine tune the roadmap as we go. So this process will take place through most of 2025 as well. But there are some things that we've begun to already implement, and a lot of them relate to language access. So the one takeaway I hope you get from this portion of the webinar is really that language access is something that can really go a long way. If this is all that you focus on, it really does increase the accessibility of your programs, your clinical trials. So doing things like making sure that any patient-facing language is culturally appropriate or translated, but not just translated in a, in an engine, but also making sure that the translation is back translated and made sure to be, culturally relevant, using accessible language, avoiding jargon, making sure that diverse communities are consulted in the creation of any patient information or patient-facing materials. So making sure that you're working with the greater advocacy organizations that cater to the needs of various communities when you're putting together materials or educational materials. Also working with the greater clinician networks and making sure that they are trained and educated on what inclusive practices are, and also making sure that you're having a constant conversation with the community as you work to put together, language access plans, language access initiatives, making sure that you're constantly getting a pulse check from the community on what the needs are and where you can improve on the accessibility of your language and your materials. And another thing that we mentioned earlier in the presentation is also just working with site staff and the clinical sites that are on your studies, making sure that they are also aware of what can be done and working with them to sort of steer the practices and processes that increase the diversity of the clinical trials population. So some things that Avidity has done as well on top of this, and I actually just polled our clinical team before this call, and is just using translation services that work with diverse communities, making sure that these translations are back translated as well, working with organizations that have resources for Spanish speaking patients, for example, or other language speaking populations, and making sure that they're helping with this translation of materials. And also for Avidity's example, using services to translate in local languages. For example, in our phase 3 study, we're planning on having sites across the world. So making sure where IRB allows, making sure that those materials that are going to be in front of participants are also translated into their language. So that's just one example. I'm happy to talk about the work that others are doing, and I'm appreciative of Rx4good for all the support as we put together this roadmap and this task force. Now I'll pass it on to Grisel.
Thank you, Luis. So hopefully you guys are all holding up and hearing some great examples on the ground of what this looks like and what this means. As I mentioned before, I worked on a few multi-site studies, one which focused on testing Latinx youth for HIV and linking them to care. So I just want to share a little story. The study took place in urban areas across the United States and Puerto Rico, and it was specifically in communities with a large Latino population. So at the national level, we provided all study materials in English and in Spanish, with the expectation that each site would localize the information and then submit it to their IRBs. As part of that work, I had the opportunity to observe enrollment activities at different sites, and one particular visit stands out for me. One site chose not to submit the Spanish consent form and the Spanish study materials to the IRB, and this forced their staff member to translate in real time a 11-page consent form and then interpret it from English to Spanish. And imagine she had to do this with each and every person who was interested as she enrolled them time and time again. So this is an example of what not to do, and I'm certain this still happens today. So what I want to do is actually talk about, some of the problems of this approach and then share with you, how we prepared for a recent example of a focus group we hosted last month. So, some of the problems with this example that I just mentioned was, that the consent form process is inconsistent, and you can't guarantee that the language used to describe the study is clear, it's fifth grade reading level, and that it's consistent across all of the people that you enroll. It ends up providing this undue or creating this undue burden that is placed on the staff, as then they're forced to recall, pages worth of words in real time, while also trying to ensure that the person understands the study, that they're answering their questions, and that they're managing other consent procedures or other activities related to the consent procedures. And then it's an ethical issue, right? We're not meeting the IRB's minimum standards of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice when we don't take the time to provide communities with materials in the languages that are going to be most effective in reaching them, and then sending them home with materials in a language that they don't understand, right? It has the opposite message. The real message is we cannot be bothered. It's not enough, we don't have the time or the energy to put towards preparing materials in the language that you prefer. And that's not the message that we want to be sending to communities. So you can imagine there's probably other things that you can point out from this example as problematic, but at the end of the day, the research integrity comes into question when you allow for this type of design approach to take place. So let's talk a little bit about an example of what should be done. As I mentioned earlier, next slide. Last month, my team and I hosted a focus group in Spanish in the Little Village area here in the Chicagoland area, which, if you're familiar with that area, it's a predominantly Mexican and Mexican-American community. We have bilingual and bicultural staff on our team who come from different countries, Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, Colombia, and that allows us to examine language differences because not all Spanish is the same, and dialects differ. So some of the same words can have different meanings in different communities. And we started off by assessing what were all the materials that we needed to translate. And it turned out for this project, there were 24 documents that we needed to translate. Everything from the recruitment flyer to the gift card instructions for the participants when they were receiving it at the end of the session. Next slide. Next, we began the translation process, which for folks who are not familiar, translation is the act of converting written information in one language into written information in another language or languages. We jump-started our process by using a high-quality software. I am not talking about Google Translate. This strategy allows us to save time and money and actually helps reduce the mental burden of having to translate so many documents spanning from 1 to 22 pages for this particular project. And so it helped us in conducting that first pass of translation activities. But it's not enough to translate only using translation software. Next slide. Translation softwares don't replace human translation support and experience. Remember that I said not all Spanish is the same. So having diverse Spanish speakers on our team allowed us to effectively engage in the following steps that I'll be sharing in the next few slides. So I conducted the first pass editing the translation to ensure clarity, completeness of the translation, and word choice. Next slide. Then I sent it to 2 different team members to review. They reviewed the information to make sure that the language was clear, appropriate, and made sense to just the average person, that we weren't using any jargon or academic language. They also made recommendations. So you can see here some of the words that change from the translation to new words that appear in bold red font. Next slide. Then the 3 of us met as a team and engaged in transcreation activities for some of the materials. So that means adapting content from one language to another to ensure the tone, the style, and the intent are intact. So in this slide, then you can see additional revisions were made in red font. And that's the types of revisions that we made, at the end of that meeting. Next slide. So we repeated these steps until we finalized this high quality translation that met our goals for all the documents. And then we were finally ready to use the tools, next slide, for our focus group session. So, and we engaged in interpretation activities. Again, so interpretation activities are verbally communicating or signing, such as American Sign Language, written or oral information from one language to another. And it turned out one of my former colleagues' mom was at this session. So a few weeks after the session, she texted me to say, my mom said that the food was delicious and it was great that the event happened. She totally felt listened to and appreciated the opportunity. So I just wanted to share these examples, and hopefully you can see the difference between the observations that I did for one multi-site study and the activities that we engaged in for another one. By taking the time to prepare for effective communication with non-English speakers or folks with disabilities, you're able to reduce the burden on your team by providing them sufficient time to prepare and review the translated materials. Study participants are able to focus on the content of the conversation and not on us struggling in real time to translate and interpret information. And then research teams are able to avoid pitfalls and focus on collecting feedback from study participants that they seek to better understand these issues. Now I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Grisel. I'm gonna sort of start bringing us home here and say, nobody said this was easy. And if you get my 90s music reference, thank you. You know, we could really do an entire webinar on why this is hard. We could spend hours with, you know, reasons and challenges and roadblocks. And we're not going to do that. And at the same time, we want to acknowledge that this isn't easy and it's not nothing. We're also going to acknowledge that it can be done and there are great opportunities and ways forward. Some of the challenges that you're probably already thinking about, time. So there is a time commitment. You need to make sure that there's time to understand who the population is that you're talking about. Grisel talked about that needs assessment component for language access planning. This is true also of diversity action plans. Ensuring that the language needs are clear and then the materials are in the appropriate languages, right? This is all time. There's also obviously a money component. So Grisel gave an example, as did Luis, about translating and interpreting and transcreation. And there is funding required for this. Also, Samara talked about having multilingual staff. Which, as we know, also costs money. It also might mean staff-wise hiring differently. So, and when you're hiring for a project or hiring for a new clinical program, maybe that means bringing on some multilingual staff members, or maybe it means adding some additional staff. It's also complex. Grisel's example really highlighted this in just thinking only about Spanish for a minute, and all of the different dialects and Spanish that's spoken across the world. And there are, you know, of all the languages have dialects. So there is a level of complexity to this that not only is about language, but also about culture, country of origin, current country of residence, and the community itself. So this is nuanced and it is complex. And there's a lot of information that we need. Right. And I know many of you are scratching your heads over, we don't even know exactly who's in the patient population that we're trying to recruit for onto the trial because people are underdiagnosed, because we're, you know, our tracking of folks who are diagnosed with specific diagnoses may not be accurate. We don't necessarily have those data. So this can be hard. And the good news is, there are things that we can do. And there are things, hopefully, maybe that you picked up today that are helpful, and probably things that you're already doing, whether you realized it or not. One of the things that was highlighted today was about creative resource use. So Grisel talked about the use of AI and translation support. Yes, we're by no means go use Google Translate and call it a day. And there are some good quality translation AI programs that can give you a jump start, as in Grisel's example. There are other forms of translation support and thinking about how to use those creatively. Similarly, along those creative use lines, think about collaboration. So what are you good at? And do you have a partner who's good at another piece of this? Whether it's working with another pharmaceutical company, if it's working with an organization like Pyxis Partners or Rx4good or Access, or if it's finding an expert out in the community and bringing them in. We think about community engagement here when we think about collaboration, bringing folks from the community in as those expert collaborators. Starting early. Now, there are two sides of this. I want to be really clear. Yes, you want to, as soon as you can, we're preclinical. Let's start talking about language access for when we set up that first trial. Thinking about it in terms of study design, planning, site selection, budgeting, staffing, all of these things. And that does not mean that if you're already in the middle of a phase 3 study, it's too late to do anything about language access. So that's also the beauty. You can always go back and make sure that those materials are appropriately translated, that interpretation is happening, that folks have access to information written and spoken. It's never too late to increase the access for folks to your trial. The last kind of opportunity we want to share here is about doing better. And I know there's a great quote that I'm not even going to try to quote because I know I'll get it wrong, but it's something along the lines of letting perfect get in the way of good, or again, I'm sure I'm misquoting that, but I'd like you to conjure the spirit of that quotation here. Thinking about doing better is always better than doing nothing. So in Grisel's example, we can think about while transcreation is best, interpretation is better, right? So let's just get to better at least, and strive for best. We're always striving for best. Grisel, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So whether you're starting a new study or you're in the middle of implementing an existing study, Pyxis Partners and Rx4good can help you wherever you are at in that process for language access planning or community engagement. And we wanted to just drop in another poll and see, after hearing today's presentation, is there anything that you are interested in starting today, just to kick us off? And then we can pass it over to Heidi, who can facilitate a Q&A session for folks who are able to stick around. And I see some of the results coming in. All right, so we've got folks who at minimum are thinking we can read that language access plan. I think that's a great start. Lots of folks who want to conduct needs assessment and host trainings. And then looking at this list, it looks like hiring more bilingual staff and finding out a little bit more about whether or not their organization has interpretation and translation services. And we've got a small cohort that are not sure, and that's okay too. Thank you so much for your time. This is a great opportunity for us to create a space for discussion and dialogue. So I'm going to pass it over to Heidi. I encourage you guys to either ask questions in the Q&A box that we have or share comments. We'd love to open up a discussion to understand what resonates and then what's still unclear.
Thank you, Grisel. If you have a question, drop it in the Q&A box for sure. We did have an earlier question from Yuri, thank you, who asked about where it should be in the budgeting. Should it be part of the budget justification when applying for grants, or should it come out of companies out of pocket? And we did answer that in the course of the presentation, saying we recommend budgeting for this work as part of the proposal development process. So not an add-on, something that's an integral piece of the process to make sure that it's as effective as it can be. Any other questions coming up? Anything on your mind about this?
I think just to add on the budgeting piece to it, I think it kind of goes back to the sort of the first step of the roadmap that was developed. It kind of dealt with initiatives that could be applied internally at Avidity. And so I think the road efforts to increase, language access planning or diversity in clinical trials need to be sort of socialized a bit within the organization. So ahead of the budgeting season, having meetings with different program teams, kind of different people from across the organization to get people's opinions. And I think hear a little bit of the questions, maybe sometimes there may be a little bit of pushback. So understanding kind of what that is so that you can really get the folks at your organization to understand kind of why this work needs to be done, educate it a little bit, and then kind of go from there to incorporating it into the budget planning process.
I think that's a great point, Luis. It also points to if you begin that cross-functional communication, that there could be some cost efficiencies as well in sharing those services across teams. So that's a great point.
We know some people came here on solely as learners, but I'm very certain that there are people on this call who have done this work. Is there anybody willing to unmute and just share your own experiences, or maybe where there were like facilitators or barriers when you were doing this work? So everyone's a learner here, starting baseline.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. You'll see, oh, sorry. Go ahead if you want to.
No problem. Heidi, thanks so much for at least helping us through a short Q&A. We are going to share our email address after this slide in case folks feel more comfortable following up with us offline. We just wanted to recap a couple key takeaway points, especially for folks who came midway through. So, addressing language access in clinical trials, it's not currently mandated by the FDA or other regulatory bodies, but it's a best practice. And language access planning isn't quick or simple, but it is actionable and manageable. And the plans that the FDA and HHS shared provide a nice roadmap for you guys. I love that word, to get you started. There's guidance, and we'll share some resources after this call in addition to those language access plans. But you also have a community in the folks that were around this call today. So you have agency to take action and make a difference in any step that you take towards moving towards incorporating language access plans, whether it's for non-English speakers, limited English speakers, or folks with disability. It really does help move the needle towards equity. Even the fact of hosting these conversations in your organizations, I think, is a big win. So with that, we're going to hang back. If anybody does feel comfortable or want to have a conversation with us in the smaller space. Next slide. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And this is how you can get a hold of us. So we hope you at least learn one new thing participating on this call today. And we appreciate you joining us today. Take care.
Thank you all so much. You'll see an evaluation link a survey link in the chat. If I could direct your attention there. Of course, we always appreciate in advance those of you who will fill that out for us. One other follow-up, we'd like to invite you to participate in some industry research that Pyxis and Rx4good are conducting, and we'll be following up with an email that has more details and a survey link. But briefly, we're seeking to understand where companies are in their process and knowledge around diversity action plans broadly, and also to identify the primary pain points in the hopes that we can help develop some effective solutions to overcome them. So companies who participate, if you participate in our research, you'll receive a readout of the de-identified findings. So as we all, work to advance this, we appreciate your participation and your willingness to help us all learn. So thank you so much for your time today. We hope you found the discussion helpful and the time was well spent. As both Grisel and Rebecca mentioned, if you have other questions as you continue to think about this, please feel free to reach out. You see Grisel and Rebecca's emails are right here, and we'd be happy to set up time to talk through any challenges that you might be facing or questions. So with that, thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
You.